been about. There's other issues that we've been talking about. And so we are optimistic that we have the opportunity to have some fiscal sanity. If you look at the numbers, look at interest rates, look at inflation, look at all these things, it's really caused because we have had no fiscal sanity up here for decades. So we're unified in doing that. And so we've got a variety of people who are going to speak. But I want to thank Scott Perry for being here. I think the House Freedom Caucus is clearly taking the lead on how do we make sure together, both the House and the Senate together, we come together to bring some fiscal sanity, which is exactly what, I can tell you my state, that's what people want. So Congressman Scott Perry.
Well, thanks, Senator, and thank you all for being here. I don't think it's a mystery to anybody in the room, certainly not the folks behind me. American people are struggling. All their prices are higher, from lettuce to lumber. They can't afford their groceries. They can't afford to get to work. They can't afford their heating bills, their credit card bills. The world becomes more dangerous every single day. And I'm not just talking about faraway places that concern them, in their very own communities, And most of these problems are born out of Washington, D.C. And they sent us here to fight on their behalf so that they could afford to live in their homes and live their lives, and so that they don't have to live in fear, whether it's a wide open border or nuclear weapons being threatened somewhere around the globe. And so we're here to say we're going to fight for the American people. We've been fighting for them, and this is how we're going to do it. So the first thing that needs to happen is the spending in Washington, D.C. is driving the cost of everything up. Now, it's still too much for many of us, but was agreed to around Memorial Day was this FRA number of $1.59 trillion. No more gimmicks. Most of the House voted for it. Most of the Senate voted for it. That's where we have to be. Don't be adding stuff onto it. Let's write the appropriations bills. Let's get the spending bills right. Let's set that as the number. And then when we do that, let's start conferencing bills. We're calling on our friends in the Senate. My colleagues here that are with us today already agree with this. We need Senate leadership to put these bills to conference. Let's get the process started where the American people know what's being spent, know how their members vote, and know what it's being spent on. Next, reauthorization of FISA. It can't be hooked to anything. The federal government has spied on Americans, whether you're Catholic and you decided to go to church or whether you went to a school board meeting. This has to end. Reauthorization needs to stand on its own, and it needs to have significant reform. Finally, on any supplemental at all, the House is going to remain closed for business unless the country being supplemented is named Israel. And oh, by the way, these things have to be paid for. We're out of money, ladies and gentlemen. Next month, we'll go over $34 trillion in debt in this country, and next year we'll spend $1 trillion on interest. This has to end. If we want to spend money on things, we all get that, and we want to support our allies in Israel. But we're going to have to pay for those things, and there are ways to do it. That has to be done. Has to be fully offset. So with that, in the absence of, I'm going to turn to Bob Good from Virginia.
Thank you, Chairman Perry. When are we going to begin to fight for the American people? And when is too much debt and too much spending enough? When is it enough? We are at historic times. With a record historic $2.5 trillion deficit we're on track for in these last 12 months. With $34 trillion in debt now, we'll be at $36 trillion by the end of this Congress. We've got historically high inflation that's crushing the American people, whether it's gas prices, grocery prices, utility prices, housing prices. We've got historically high interest rates, further exacerbating our debt situation. The American people are suffering. We are heading for a fiscal, financial, and economic collapse. And yet, even with a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, we have not shown a demonstrated desire to cut our spending, even with the Republican majority. What I just described is happening on our watch, and we have nothing to show to this point when it comes to spending with a Republican majority in the House. What is our resolve to cut our spending this year over last year? What is our resolve to use the leverage we have with the power the American people have given us with a House majority? To the chairman's point just a moment ago, Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, the President, the Senate, and the House together agreed, apart from our support, we didn't support that because it was too much, but agreed to the FRA level, $1.59 trillion, cutting about $100 billion from the 1.7 omnibus bill that was signed a year ago, And yet we don't even have a commitment at this point for that top line spending level for total programmatic spending for this coming year. What are we prepared to do to secure the border? What are we prepared to do to stop the invasion at our southern border? We should not be willing to fund a government that continues to bankrupt the American people and to flood our nation with hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens a day. We had some 10,000 yesterday. Irreparable harm is being done to the country by this president intentionally, and the only possible stopgap, the only possible barrier is the House majority. We're so thankful to have our Senate colleagues here, the conservative leaders of the Senate, here with us today to say enough is enough. We are determined to fight for the American people. And with that,
Let me, Senator Marshall and then Chip Roy.
Senator Marshall.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Border, border, border. You know, we just had lunch with Speaker Johnson. That's what he said. He wished he had a T-shirt for every one of us that said border, border, border. And that's exactly what the topic is in my office. That's what the topic is back home. You know, everybody I talked to in Kansas these last 10 days, their biggest worry, their biggest concern is about their own safety and security of their own families in the heartland, in the middle of the country, in Kansas, where we're losing a person every day, a young adult every day to fentanyl poisoning. You know, the job of leaders is to identify and to set priorities. And as I look at the supplemental package that Leader Schumer is throwing at us right now, my priorities 1, 2, and 3 are the border, and the border. And that unless there's meaningful reform that secures our border, we're not going to vote for cloture on any type of legislation, supplemental legislation, unless it includes border security. And I'm proud that our leadership is saying the same thing. So I'm here today to put down a marker to say, hell no, I won't go unless there's border security. That's what my life is dedicated to from now until Christmas. My life is dedicating for this once-in-a-generation opportunity to secure this border. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for our friends from the Senate, Scott Perry, Chairman of the Freedom Caucus, for joining us here today. This is one of the most important press conferences that we've had and that I've been a part of. I was just home over Thanksgiving, like all of us were. Monday morning, before I flew back, I was at a coffee shop after I took my kids to school, and this young man, an Hispanic young man, came up to me, grew up in Laredo, lives in San Antonio. He's a constituent. And he looked at me, and his eyes welled up. And he said, my family is under constant siege back home in Laredo. He said, our state is under constant siege. He said, I can barely pay my bills, and I'm watching the United States government leave us stranded. He said, thank you. Thank you for being my voice. Thank you for standing up and defending me. Okay? Those are the people that this group represents, unapologetically. When I took the floor on the Thursday before we left for Thanksgiving, I said a few things. I said a few things about whether or not Republicans had anything at all, any one thing that we could stand up and defend. And of course, my Democrat colleagues like to make hay out of that because they leave off the important clause after that, which is other than to say that we're just a little bit better than Democrats. That's what's at stake right now. Our border is wide open. I want to be unequivocally clear to the Speaker of the House, to Republican leadership. If the word Ukraine is uttered on the floor of the House of Representatives before we have secured the border, passed H.R. 2 out of the Senate, with the president signing it, with metrics attached, that is an utter fail by Republicans. I want to be completely clear. We must secure the border. There cannot be any equivocation about it. There cannot be any half measures. We owe it to the American people to stand up and secure the border, and we did that. The core policies in H.R. 2, parole fixes, asylum reforms, limits on the CBP-1 app, turnaway authority, empowerment of state AGs to sue and defend those laws. We need those fixes. We need TVPRA and Flores to ensure that the unaccompanied children are safe, like we do with Mexico and Canada, but for all countries. My Republican colleagues are all too quick to want to trade those off as if they're unimportant, as if the child being sold into the sex trafficking trade as we speak is unimportant because oh, we have our precious. We must pass the NDAA. We have our precious. We must fund the federal government at its full tilt at the Nancy Pelosi spending levels. Which brings me to my final point. Spending restraint means actual restraint. It doesn't mean the fraud that is perpetrated in this town on a regular basis by Republicans and Democrats alike. All of the so-called side deals that will blow the lid off of the FRA spending are completely unacceptable. And to the Speaker and to Senate Republicans, I say, if we're going to actually cut spending, it needs to actually cut spending year over year. Because the average American family eating $11,000 a year in additional costs, as reported by CBS last night, they're expecting all of us to stand up and defend them. We're their voice. The average American, the average Texan who can't pay their bills, who are watching their border be wide open, watching cartels exploit our border, kill their kids, trying to get empowered. And we're over here nibbling around the edges saying, oh, we must pass the NDAA. So take out all the provisions that make it better. Why? So we can check a box and get something done as we head home to our family dinners at Christmas. That's the way this place works, and it needs to end. Republicans together need to stand up and say, we'll eat Christmas dinner right here in Washington. We'll stay here into January. We'll do what it takes to stand up for every American who's getting left behind by an administration that is more concerned about advancing a radical leftist agenda than defending the American people they were sent here to defend. Senator Johnson? Or no?
Andy,
Okay.
it's Andy Biggs.
So last night, in the Tucson sector, there were 2,700 apprehensions. 2,700 in one sector of the 9 southwestern border sectors. And we don't even count the gotaways because they were just about the same number. The sector chief in the Tucson sector has said we basically have no CBP patrolling the border today. Why? Because they are all processing and transporting people as they are inundated. The border is uncontrollably open. The cartels are waging a war in the little village on the other side, on the south side of the border in Sassabee. They're burning out people who won't surrender and leave their homes for the cartels to take over. Why? Because that will be the jumping off place for human and drug trafficking through the Tucson sector. They're moving it over. That's how the cartels work. This administration supports that. They are the logistical arm of the cartel in human and sex trafficking and drug trafficking. That's what's at stake on the southern border. At the same time, we have an administration through multiple administrations that have been weaponized to spy on the American citizen, but none quite so avidly as the Biden administration. So, when 702 comes up for reauthorization, we have proposed numerous reforms to constrain the police and surveillance apparatus of the federal government, and it must be done. I commend Senator Lee and Senator Lee and Wyden, who lead that in the Senate, and Representatives Davison and Lofgren leading it in the House. We're going to mark that bill up next week, and we're going to start taking back the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment protections that belong to every American citizen. And I'm going to just elaborate on one last point, and that is on the spending. Obviously, it cannot continue at this pace. We must reverse course. But if you want to tell me that we're going to spend more money for Ukraine, or we're going to continue spending at the kind of levels that even a 1596, $1.596 trillion is, without first securing the border with measurable benchmarks, then this country may be irredeemably lost. I'm grateful for the senators who are here who are fighting this in the Senate, my colleagues in the House who are with me. We fight it in the House. This country has much to go yet. But at this current pace, if you think that we can take another 11, 12, 13 months of the Biden administration's spending, as well as its open border and its surveillance of the American citizen,
you're not understanding the existential crisis that we face. I'm proud and pleased to stand with my friends fighting this, and I call on the Speaker of the House to not just be a bellwether conservative, but to actually stand up and fight. Thank you.
There was a British lawmaker named John Wilkes in the 1760s. John Wilkes was an open critic of King George III and published a circular known as the North Briton. When he published North Briton number 45, he was arrested. He was arrested because he was too critical of the king and his ministers. Lord Halifax had him arrested. Among the topics of his criticism were the fact that King George III and his agents were using things like writs of assistance and general warrants. And if you're not familiar with those things, they're basically warrants that say there are crimes that may have been committed, go find evidence related to them, have fun. This, of course, was in violation of the rights of English subjects, and John Wilkes knew that. He brought suit against Lord Halifax, and he was awarded thousands of pounds, a lot of money in those days. By doing that, he became a hero on both sides of the Atlantic. And his story was very familiar to the American people, and I have no doubt that that helped inspire the adoption of the Fourth Amendment. We desperately need the Fourth Amendment right now. It's been overlooked, it's been trampled on in meaningful ways, in ways that closely reflect what happened to John Wilkes. The use of things like general warrants and writs of assistance, while they don't exist under those titles today, exist today in the form of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Anytime you authorize the government to go and collect information on American citizens without a warrant, and then you allow them to search those databases and that the contents of those phone calls without a warrant, you've got a problem. It's not unreasonable what we're asking, but let me tell you what you're going to continue to hear as we march toward the December 31st expiration deadline for FISA 702. You're going to hear things like, this will make it too hard for the government. It will be more difficult for the government to get the information that it wants. Well, big surprise. That's the whole point of the Fourth Amendment. The whole point of having a constitution is to make certain things more difficult for the government to carry out. Why? Well, because we all benefit when we do, and because bad things happen when they don't. When governments are left out of control, horrible things happen. Take the fact that we've overlooked other parts of our Constitution, like the limited enumerated powers, implicit in the concept of federalism and explicit in the 10th Amendment. Since the late 1930s, we've pretended as if there is no limit to federal power. Since at least the 1970s, we pretended as if there is functionally no limit to the amount of money we spend. Those two things together, they're deadly. And they're exactly what has produced today, after decades of inflationary spending and years of multi-trillion-dollar deficits, a situation in which the American poor and middle-class family is being choked, taking on an additional $1,000 a month in basic monthly expenses, just because people in Washington want the momentary rush that comes from the momentary praise that comes from spending other people's money beyond what they actually have. Shame on them, shame on us to the extent we've enabled them. The way this has worked over and over again is the law firm. Until recently, I called it the law firm of Schumer, McConnell, McCarthy, and Jeffries. I won't throw Mike Johnson's name in there, at least not yet, because he's not been there long enough. I hope he doesn't join the firm. But the firm will come up with a spending bill that spends too much, that they throw on us at the very last minute with nobody having a chance to read it. And this is why we're $33.5 trillion in debt. This is why we're spending now at a rate of about $1 trillion a year just in interest on our national debt, up from $350 billion a year just a few years ago. The American people can't handle this anymore. They need FISA reauthorization to occur only with stringent conditions, like those found in the Government Surveillance Reform Act. That should be passed. We've got time to pass it. There's no reason for a temporary extension. We need to do it now. And we need to decide now that we're going to cut spending dramatically. We've got to do these things and make sure that we get aid to our allies in Israel without costing any money. The only reason that isn't law right now is because of Democrats in the Senate. It's passed the House. It could go to the president's desk. It could become law tonight, and the thing is paid for. The only people standing between us are Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden, who won't let it move. Shame on them.
I like your reference to the firm. That would be career politicians have been running the show for a long time. You've heard about what we're dealing with. You look at the simple task of what we need to do each year, the part that still is supposed to go through a budget process that we've not done and really adhered to in nearly a couple decades. Last time I think that happened was back in the Clinton administration. But look at it. Simple task of about 1/4 of what we spend. We can't even get within 15% of making it balance. It's 17.8% off. That is pitiful. You know what happens in the real world? You go through Chapter 11. If you're a state that runs like this, you're going to have trouble borrowing money. And a lot of the states that roll like this place deal with the same consequences. Paint you a picture of how this turns out. First of all, I've been on the Budget Committee all 5 years. It's a useless appendage. We have never used it. We don't even get a top line out of it. I'm a senator that gave up a spot on the Appropriations Committee because when I was on it, we didn't do one meeting with appropriators. And then what did we get? Not even a top line until after the end of the fiscal year. And you get that monstrosity of an omnibus bill that's cooked up by the firm that gives us that result. And what is worse, the way this plays out, Medicare Trust Fund goes broke in about 5 years. Social Security that employers and employees have been paying into 8 or 9 years. Then the wheels fall off, the firm is gone, and we've got the mess, which is the mess of debt that is so hard to calculate what the interest would be. The only blueprint out there is our fearless leader, Biden, puts us $42 trillion in debt in 5 years, $52 trillion in debt in 10 years. Do the math on what 4 to 5% higher interest rates are going to be with that burden. Shameless to future generations that we put this burden on them. You're going to hear some particulars fleshed out on supplemental and other things, but this is all couched in the context that if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to systematically go broke, and future generations are going to have to pick up the pieces. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mike. First of all, I want to thank all of our conservative House colleagues for trucking over here to the Senate, not only today, but consistently over the last year, meeting with the conservatives in the Senate, trying to resolve and fix some of these issues. I'll point out it's those meetings that resulted in, for example, us getting through the whole debt ceiling crisis. You'll remember it was the House Freedom Caucus that proposed a piece of legislation and then compromised with our House colleagues and offered the Senate a pretty common sense piece of legislation that, again, got us past that. So, again, we're trying to lead in this instance as well. Just real quick on this chart before I put up the border chart. I keep playing with the numbers. I'm an accountant, and I thought this was pretty simple, pretty interesting. When you take a look at what we passed in terms of budget authority over the last 4 years, it was $5.6 trillion, but we outlaid $6.6 trillion. So other supplemental funding, I mean, just, disaster relief, whatever, another 18% onto what we had passed in terms of appropriation bills. It is completely out of control. But let's put up the border, because this is really what I came to talk about. It is unfortunate, and I completely agree with what the House has passed in terms of H.R. 2, that type of language, in the hands of a president that actually wanted to secure the border, in the hands of an administration that would faithfully execute the laws passed by Congress, H.R. 2 would work. But we don't have that with this administration. Our open border, Biden's open border, is a clear and present danger to America. And no matter what we pass legislatively, we can't trust the president, his administration, to faithfully execute that law. So we have one leverage point here. The administration wants funding for Ukraine. We need to use that leverage point, and we need to make any funds that go to Ukraine contingent on the administration actually reducing the number of migrants that are being dispersed in America. Now, since this administration started, it's been about over 6 million people, at least 6 million. 1.7 million of that are detected gotaways. We have no idea who these people are or where they located. We really don't know where the other 5.3 million people are, the ones that were encountered, processed, and dispersed. This is completely out of control. You have Hamas now calling for days of rage. Do you think in that 1.7 million or the overall 6 million there may be a bad person or two? It's a clear and present danger. So what the Senate must insist on is if they take up a supplemental, if they're looking at funding for Ukraine, Republicans in the Senate must hold firm and deny cloture on any bill that doesn't include benchmarks, hard metrics. And again, the metric needs to be number of migrants dispersed into America, whether, again, they're encountered, processed, and dispersed, or detectable gotaways, or any other category. And we need to deny cloture on any bill that doesn't include that hard metric. And just as an example, and you can see in this chart, President Trump had to deal with the effect of DACA, the lawless actions of the Obama administration, which really sparked this multi-year border crisis. But just through sheer willpower, with the current laws in place, this President Trump basically secured the border in a 12-month time period. And so that's what the bill I'm working on in terms of providing metrics, again, where the Ukraine funding would be contingent on those metrics being met and certified, you would ramp that down to pretty much secure border over 12 months. That's what we need to do. That's what I think conservatives in both the House and Senate will definitely insist on. It's what the American people insist on. We need to be more concerned about securing our own border, protecting our own citizens, our own homeland, before we provide $60 billion of funding for Ukraine. And next is Rick.
Okay, so if Reagan was here today, he'd say, what the hell has happened to his country, right? So here's the takeaway today. We have all been working together all year. And there's two takeaways with this. Number one, we've got to start the path of fiscal sanity. And we're going to do everything we can to start that path. Everybody up here, we'd like to have a balanced budget. Every one of us. We know that's what you have to do. But we're willing to work with everybody else to start the path. And if whoever it is, Republican or Democrat in the Senate, in the House, doesn't want to do that, we're going to fight like hell to change that. Number two, we are going to secure the border. Nothing's going to get passed with regard to Ukraine unless this border is going to be secure. And it's going to be clear. It's not going to be, oh, we tried, we passed some BS that doesn't do anything. It will only happen if we have real border security to pass. So the two big things on top of FISA. But this group, we're going to keep working, and we're going to work together, which is in contrast to when I first came up here where House and Senate didn't work together. We're going to work together to make sure these things happen. So any of us can take any questions.
Questions? Stay here. Go ahead, sir.
I've got a detailed question. You talked about the 1.59 trillion. I feel at one point you guys were pushing 1.47. Are you guys coming up in your number to make it?
Well, look, like I said in my remarks in the beginning, 159 is too expensive for many of us, but we realize that 147 is not going to happen. But my goodness, the House overwhelmingly supported this 159, and so did the Senate. And so the fact that just a few months later they're already willing to just go beyond that like it doesn't exist is absurd. It is too much, but that has to be the limit, and it's 159 actual programmatic spending. It's not 159 plus rescissions and chimps and all that other stuff. 159's it.
And if there's any supplemental funding, it will be paid for. Just like what they did, you might talk about that. Just like what they passed in the House with regard to Israel, it was paid for. And there's a lot of things. You got IRS funding, you got this slush fund of $400 billion for Green New Deal stuff. There's plenty of money to be cut. Ma'am.
It sounds like during Speaker Johnson's lunch on this side of the building, he talked about what could happen with a continuing resolution. It sounds like, please correct me if I'm wrong, Senator, he said that he would do a full year CR if they couldn't get appropriations bills done by February 2nd. Is that what your understanding was? And for the House folks, how does that sound to you guys? Okay.
Number one, the goal is to get this done. The goal is to have Schumer start doing his job. What we ought to do, the House is doing their job. They're passing spending bills. We ought to be doing the same thing here. I don't know when was it last time we passed it? Was it sometime middle of October is the last time we even talked about spending over here? The House has passed a variety of things. Why aren't we bringing them up? This is all Schumer trying to get this big omnibus where he and a few others get to decide what's in it. And that's not going to happen this year.
Yeah, I'll just add that I wasn't over in the Senate lunch, but to the extent that the Speaker was talking about a full year CR, I think there's a pretty good article in was it Roll Call this morning or yesterday, walking through the implications of that, right? And what you talk about, if you actually adhere to the caps that were passed in Memorial Day weekend, that those caps would truly set spending probably in the mid 1.5s, right? If you actually follow that, and or if you apply the sequester, right, it would drop those numbers down. So the point here is we want spending level to be 1.59 or lower. But if we're going to talk about setting a top line spending level for moving the appropriations bills, which is our goal because the American people expect us to do our job, we've passed 7. I think there's probably at least 3 or 4 others we could probably pass out of the House, get to conference. Let's go work it through at a spending level at 1.59 or lower. That's what we're saying. Let's do our job. And I think what the Speaker is saying is that if the Senate won't work with us to do that, then the default position is going to put it at a pretty aggressive cut into the 1.5s if the Senate is unwilling to do their job and do what we did in the House.
Congressman Roy, can you clarify what you said earlier about the NDAA? Would you not support passing the NDAA if there's not a deal on border security to lower the number of migrants coming across the border? And is there money for authorization for Ukraine that you find problematic in the NDAA?
First of all, what I said explicitly, and I think reflects at least most of the feeling of the folks on the stage, and let them speak for themselves, is that for the United States House or Senate to move forward with anything additional for Ukraine without having, as Senator Scott articulated, without having done our job to secure the border of the United States in the form of H.R. 2 and the metrics that Senator Johnson walked you through, that would be not just a mistake, but it should be dead on arrival. We should not do that. And that's our message, and we're being very clear about that. The NDAA, we should actually be going to conference and doing the work we're supposed to do rather than four corners conversations and deals to jam through a watered-down NDAA with a short-term extension of FISA on the back of it, which is what is being talked about. That shouldn't be the case. We didn't come here. We didn't change the rules in January. We didn't have the fights we've had this year to go back to four-corner deals negotiating, to jam through bad legislation the American people don't want, that doesn't reform our military to focus on its mission rather than social engineering, that doesn't make us do our job with respect to protecting the rights of American citizens through FISA rather than jamming it all through as this town wants to do.
I think first of all, we're all fed up. We're all fed up of 4 people making these decisions. We're fed up with, somebody just comes into lunch and gives us our orders, and that's what we're supposed to do. And I think on their side, we're fed up. They're fed up with it, what happened over there, and we're fed up with it.
Yeah, as a NDAA conferee, I'm still waiting for the invitation to the conference.
Yeah,
I'm waiting for it at this moment. So until I see it, I won't be signing anything, sir.
You said earlier that the House would be closed for business for any supplemental that's not for Israel. Does that mean that you would not be for leveraging a Ukraine?
Let me just clarify this. We're not going to countenance in the House of Representatives this omnibus supplemental that includes Ukraine and alleged more money for the border to process migrants illegally into our country and then throw Israel on it as the sweetener to try and force everybody to vote for it. That's dead on arrival in the House. It's not going to happen. We're not going to allow it to happen. Yes, ma'am.
The Speaker suggested that it be Ukraine paired with border and Israel stand alone.
Israel, they all need to stand alone because they all deserve their own debate. But most importantly, 2 things: the American citizens can't afford their own government. They can't afford their own bills right now. So if anything's going to happen, it has to be paid for. And the American citizens demands to know how their member voted on each one. Not, well, I only voted for this Ukraine thing because Israel was in it and I had to vote for Israel. The American people are sick of that. Let them stand on the merits of their own weight, and we'll see where the votes are.
Let me add one thing about the Ukraine border. So just to be clear about what we're talking about, you read in the Wall Street Journal today, and if you're talking to your typical kind of Senate leadership and gossip around town folks, what they're doing is trying to package together Ukraine with mountains of spending, which virtually all of my constituents strongly oppose no matter what, and then pile on top of that watered down border security with no metrics. That's dead on arrival. That cannot be an option. The American people didn't send us here for that. So if that's what people are talking about, that's a no-go. If what we're talking about instead is the president signs H.R. 2 and we have metrics tied to something on Ukraine, then we'll have a conversation with a full-throated debate on the floor of the House. But we should not be talking about watering down and negotiating against ourselves when the American people don't even want us to give another dollar to Ukraine, particularly when our border is wide open, Americans are dying, we're under assault, our hospitals are overrun, our police are overrun, our kids are dying from fentanyl poisonings, and they want us to have more money for Ukraine?
Let me make this just real simple on the border. There's going to be one of two things that happen by next November. We're either going to secure the border or we're not going to secure it. The Biden open border policy is going to continue. I think what we're saying is we don't want and we will not allow, to the best of our ability, any Republican fingerprints on anything that's going to keep the border open. We want to be part of the solution. By the way, that would be a huge favor to Democrats and Biden. We're not playing politics here. This would be actually detrimental politically to us. If we help Biden and force him to actually secure the border, that would fix one of the problems that the American people don't like his administration for. So we are about actually securing the border and nothing less than that. We want nothing to do, and we're going to do everything we can to block that.
Last question. Yes, ma'am.
Oh my gosh, so many questions, but I'll try and answer.
Well, you can ask members afterwards.
I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying right now. Chairman of the Freedom Caucus, you are saying that you will not accept any combination of any of these three items. Ukraine, Israel, and border all need to move separately?
Yeah, you got it. It's pretty simple, right?
All right. And now here's my question to you. I understand your H.R. 2 push. That is not going to pass the Senate. We know that. We know the president's not going to sign it. I know. I'm sorry. Anything's possible, sure. But what do you think about the perfect being the enemy of the good here? This is the only moment you may have in the next year to actually change any policy on the border. Are you concerned about pushing for something that doesn't have a real chance when you could get a change in asylum or parole?
But I would just remind, and I think my colleagues, they can speak for themselves. We already have laws on the books right now that were enforced just 3 years ago that had the numbers dramatically lower. Most people considered the border to be secure. No, it doesn't matter what we pass here in the way of legislation, even if it gets a signature, if we don't have a president and administration willing to enforce the law. And that's what we have right now. So we need to see definable, verifiable, certifiable, believable metrics that show it's actually secure. Otherwise, it's all just more failure theater up here. It's more failure theater, and we're done with the failure theater. The American people, more importantly, are done with the failure theater.
We have a lawless administration. That's all let's acknowledge. We have an administration that doesn't care what the law is, and so if we don't have metrics, nothing's going to change. They're lawless.
Right. Thank you all very much. Stick around a little bit and answer some of your questions. Awesome. Thanks. Sir. Yeah, Senator Johnson's actually working on a piece of legislation. I'm not saying that would be the final product, or that even, depending on what it is, that many of us will be in favor of. But what I think his vision is, and you can verify this with him, is that once we see reductions that are verifiable at the border, then we might be inclined to release a certain amount of money based on that. But
so is that a gentleman's agreement?
No, there's no gentleman. There's no gentleman in the administration.
Is that an agreement that you say, okay, 30% cut, we will consider this money?
We need to see numbers that because understand, the administration will move things around so that they can meet the number without actually meeting the intent, which is less people crossing our border illegally. They want the money at all costs, and they've just been known and shown to be unreliable and untruthful.
So how do you write that into law then?
Well, like I said, Senator Johnson is working on that. We're going to see what his product is. I think it possibly can be done. The question is even if it's written in legislatively,